The room smelled like cinnamon, pine candles, and something unspoken. I was standing in the corner of my own kitchen, hands resting on the marble counter, staring at him. He was barefoot, leaning against the fridge like he belonged here. Like he wasn't just visiting for Thanksgiving. Like he hadn't been 12 years old when I married his uncle. We weren't touching. We hadn't touched. But the silence between us had a pulse. He stepped closer. I didn't move. It wasn't a movie moment. It was sharper than that. Realer. Like everything in the world was suddenly still, except my heart. It wasn't racing. It was holding its breath. His eyes didn't ask. Mine didn't answer. And just before the space between us vanished, my husband called from upstairs. Something about the thermostat. That moment shattered like glass dropped on tile. And that was the beginning of everything. Before I begin the story and tell you how everything really happened, answer this question: would you be able to forgive a loved one's betrayal? It all started 2 days before Thanksgiving, when my husband told me his nephew would be staying with us for a few weeks. He mentioned it casually, like it was no big deal. Like inviting a grown man to live in our guest room indefinitely was something people just did. He got a remote job, my husband said, grabbing his travel bag. Needs a place while he figures things out. You two will get along fine. I watched him load the last of his luggage into the back of the SUV. He had a week-long conference in Seattle and wouldn't be home until after the holiday. That left me, alone, with someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone who used to be a kid. When the Uber rolled into our driveway, I didn't expect the man who stepped out. Broad-shouldered, sharper jawline, a quiet confidence that didn't exist in his teenage years. He greeted me with a smile that felt practiced. Like he knew how to charm a room without saying much. He wheeled his black carry-on through our front door like it belonged to him. We made awkward small talk. I offered him coffee. He asked for tea. I found an old tin of peppermint green and set the kettle to boil. By dinner, he had unpacked, helped me set the table, and fixed a loose kitchen cabinet door that had been bothering me for months. My husband had promised to do it eventually. You didn't have to, I said, watching him wipe the dust off his hands. He shrugged. Didn't like how it kept squeaking every time you opened it. He'd been here 3 hours. That night, after we ate and I cleared the dishes, I walked past the guest room. The door was open. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at something on his laptop. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did, and pretended not to. The next morning, he was already in the kitchen when I came down. A flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, coffee brewed, and scrambled eggs ready. My husband hadn't made me breakfast in. I don't remember. I thought you liked your eggs soft, he said without looking up. I froze. I remember from a trip we all took, he added quickly. You made a face when your eggs were overcooked. I nodded slowly. Good memory. He smiled. Some things stick. We spent most of that day getting the house ready. I pulled out the dusty Thanksgiving decorations from the garage. He climbed ladders, hung garlands, fixed a broken porch light. By late afternoon, we were both covered in glitter and laughing over a box of old ornaments. I was laughing more than I had in months. That evening, we took a walk. I told him I needed fresh air, and he offered to come. Leaves crunched under our feet as we strolled through our quiet cul-de-sac. Porch lights flickered on one by one, kids in puffer jackets zipped by on scooters. He talked about his new job. I talked about my book club. It was all normal. But it wasn't normal. It was the way he listened when I spoke. How he remembered what I'd said 5 hours earlier. How he looked at me like I wasn't just someone's wife. Like I was still someone. Later that night, I sat in my bedroom, scrolling through photos on my phone. Thanksgiving tables from past years. Smiling faces. All surface. I looked at myself in those pictures, and I couldn't remember what I was thinking in any of them. Just smiling on cue. The next day, my husband called during a layover. "I forgot to mention," he said. "He's looking for apartments in DC, might stay through December." I paused. "He's staying longer?" "Just until he finds something. Be nice to have some company while I'm gone, right?" I didn't answer. That afternoon, the nephew and I drove to Trader Joe's to stock up for the holiday. We made jokes about the absurd packaging, picked out too many cranberry-flavored snacks, and argued over pie flavors like it actually mattered. On the way home, he turned on an old playlist from high school. We sang along. Loud. Off-key. Free. Back home, he helped me unload the bags, and we laughed over the smashed sweet potatoes. That night, we didn't talk much. We sat in the living room watching a cooking competition show. I kept glancing over. So did he. When the final round started, he said, "You know, I always thought you were different." Different how? Just, not like everyone else in the family. The room got quiet. The TV shouted over us. I stood up, went to the kitchen to refill my glass. He followed. I turned. He was standing close. Not touching. Not leaning in. Just there. And that silence again. The kind that had weight. The kind that wanted to be broken. But it wasn't. Because just then, from the basement, I heard his voice. A voice I hadn't heard him use before. On the phone. "No, she's not what I expected, she's actually." I didn't hear the rest. I stood frozen in the hallway, hands still on the fridge door, the light blinking behind me like a warning. And in that second, everything I thought I knew started to unravel. I stood there for maybe a second too long, my hands still on the fridge door, his voice drifting up the basement stairs like something that had never meant to be heard. The words clung to the silence in my kitchen long after they were gone, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, until I heard him coming up. He stepped into the kitchen with a casual ease, as if nothing had happened. His phone was gone, stuffed in his back pocket, and his eyes scanned my face briefly before settling on the grocery bag left on the counter. "I forgot we still had these cranberries," he said, picking one up and tossing it into his mouth. "You okay?" I nodded too quickly and turned to rinse a dish I didn't need to rinse. I kept my back to him, unsure of whether he knew I'd heard. The rest of the day passed in a blur of little things that didn't feel little. We cleaned. We decorated. We rearranged furniture for guests that wouldn't be arriving. My husband had extended his trip, something about another meeting added at the last minute, and now he wouldn't be home until Sunday evening. That left us with 3 more full days. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the faint creaks of the house, wondering if he was still awake, wondering who had been on the other end of that phone call. Wondering if I was the she he hadn't expected. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes. He was already in the kitchen, flipping a stack of golden circles onto a plate. There was syrup, powdered sugar, and a neat bowl of strawberries on the side like some diner breakfast special. "You didn't have to do this," I said, stepping in, still in my robe. "I wanted to." We sat down across from each other. The air was heavy with the sweetness of syrup and something unspoken. He made a joke about how he used to burn pancakes all the time and how YouTube tutorials saved his reputation. I smiled, but it felt rehearsed. After breakfast, we stepped into the backyard to rake the falling leaves. The wind had picked up, pushing golden and rust-colored leaves across the lawn like scattered memories. We didn't say much. It was one of those quiet chores that didn't require conversation. He worked steadily, sleeves rolled, jaw tense. I wondered if he was thinking about the phone call. I knew I was. Halfway through the task, he paused, leaning on the handle of the rake. "You look tired," he said. "Didn't sleep well? Bad dreams?" I shook my head. "Just thoughts." He didn't ask what kind. He just looked at me for a second longer than necessary, then went back to raking. Later, we went to Trader Joe's again. The list was short: eggs, cream, more butter, but it was an excuse to get out. The air was crisp, the kind of weather that made you want to wear a scarf and drink something with cinnamon in it. Inside the store, we joked again, this time over a box of frozen mac and cheese bites. He pointed at an overly dramatic pumpkin-shaped cheesecake and said, "If this doesn't scream holiday crisis, I don't know what does." In the parking lot, as we loaded the bags into the trunk, the light shifted. It was one of those late autumn moments when the sky turns gold for no reason. He closed the trunk and turned to me. Neither of us said anything. We kissed. That evening, we stayed home. We sat in the living room with mugs of tea, the television playing a home renovation show no one was watching. He asked questions, not the kind people ask out of politeness, but the kind that made me realize he actually wanted to know. "Did you always want this kind of life?" he asked, eyes on the flickering screen. I stared into my tea. "What kind of life?" "This one. Suburbs. Neighbors with matching mailboxes. Thanksgiving decor on the 15th. I gave a half smile. I thought it would feel like safety. And now? Now it just feels quiet. A few hours later, I found myself in the laundry room, folding towels for no reason. I needed movement. I needed something to do with my hands. He walked in holding a book. "You left this on the porch," he said, placing it on the counter. It was a hardcover I hadn't opened in weeks. I couldn't remember when I'd last read anything all the way through. We stood there, the buzz of the dryer filling the space between us. "You know this isn't going to stay quiet," he said eventually. "Not forever." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't have an answer. That night, I sat at the kitchen island with a glass of wine. One turned into two. I replayed the kiss in my mind 100 different ways, each time trying to change the ending, trying to justify something that had already happened. He walked in without a word, placed a new tin of tea beside me, then leaned on the opposite end of the counter. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. "No," I said. "Okay." And then he left the room. I stayed there, alone with the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, and the weight of what hadn't yet been said. At some point, I decided to go to bed. I turned off the lights, set the alarm, and paused before heading upstairs. The guest room door was slightly ajar. Light spilled out into the hallway. I walked past it. The next morning, my husband called. He was back at the airport, an earlier flight had opened up. He'd be home tonight instead of tomorrow. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, holding the phone like it had burned me. "He's coming back tonight," I said aloud. He looked up from the couch, eyes unreadable. "Okay." We spent the rest of the morning cleaning. Vacuuming. Wiping down surfaces that didn't need to be wiped. Every movement was exaggerated, like if we worked hard enough, the guilt might dissolve. By late afternoon, the house looked untouched. Perfect. Like nothing had ever happened here. We made dinner together. Quietly. Chopping, boiling, seasoning. At 6:48 p.m., the garage door rumbled. My husband stepped in a moment later, smiling, arms full of luggage and duty-free snacks. "I missed you," he said, kissing me on the cheek. He greeted his nephew warmly. The conversation flowed easily. He didn't seem suspicious. If anything, he looked tired. Relieved to be home. We ate. We laughed. He told stories from his trip. Showed us a video of a malfunctioning hotel elevator that made everyone giggle. It almost felt normal. After dinner, while he unpacked upstairs, I cleared the dishes. Then I heard it. The soft thud of a door. The shuffle of a jacket. When I stepped into the hallway, he was gone. I checked the driveway. His car was still there. But he wasn't. I walked back in, confused, heart pounding. And then I saw it. My husband's phone, left charging on the counter, lit up with a notification. Ring, motion detected, front door camera. I tapped the screen. And there we were. 2 days ago. Me. Him. Laughing in the driveway. 2 lattes in hand. The timestamp didn't lie. But the strangest part? My husband deleted it. I watched his finger swipe it away, eyes blank, mouth tight. He knew. And said nothing. The smile on his face didn't change when he came back inside. He acted like nothing had happened. The door quietly clicked behind him, and he rejoined us in the kitchen as if he hadn't just stepped away. My husband handed him a plate of pumpkin pie with too much whipped cream, making a joke about calories being illegal during the holidays. He laughed, almost too easily. I could barely taste anything. After dessert, my husband suggested a movie. He set up the living room with the same routine he'd done for years, dimming the lights, choosing something classic but not boring, fluffing the throw pillows like they actually mattered. We ended up watching a Jack Nicholson film. My husband was quoting lines before they even happened. I couldn't focus. I kept glancing sideways, past the flickering screen, to where he sat. We didn't look at each other. Not once. But I could feel it. The same tension that hadn't left since the moment he arrived. The movie dragged. I couldn't tell you the plot. My husband laughed at all the wrong moments. I forced myself to smile. The next morning, he had the brilliant idea to visit the Leesburg Craft Fair. I hadn't been in years. It used to be something we did before life got too routine to bother. The kind of thing that sounds better in memory than in reality. But I agreed. The drive out felt longer than usual. The highway was packed, then the side roads even worse. He sat in the back seat, earphones in, gazing out the window like a tourist. My husband was rambling about some guy from work who didn't mute his mic during a Zoom call and how it caused a disaster. I nodded in the right places. The fair was exactly how I remembered: handmade soaps, wooden signs with inspirational quotes, overpriced kettle corn. Christmas music in late November. Crowds moving in slow clumps. I wandered off under the excuse of looking for a new fall-scented candle. I felt him behind me before I saw him. We ended up by a table full of beeswax ornaments, completely alone for a moment. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We kissed. It was fast, quiet, like an accident and a decision all at once. When we stepped apart, I caught the faintest hitch in his breath. He turned and disappeared into the crowd. I stood there, frozen, holding a cinnamon-scented candle I hadn't intended to buy. We didn't speak again until we were back in the car. My husband had found a small vintage suitcase he was oddly excited about and spent the drive home explaining its appeal. Neither of us reacted. The silence between us stretched longer than the highway. Back at home, my husband pulled out an old photo album. He wanted to show off some family pictures. "You probably don't remember this trip," he said, flipping to a page with a sun-faded photo of a lake. "You were, what, 15? The one sitting beside me didn't answer. My husband kept turning pages, narrating each memory like a tour guide. I watched him. He was proud, nostalgic. Completely unaware. Or pretending to be. I excused myself, went upstairs, locked the bathroom door. My breathing was shallow. I ran cold water over my wrists and stared into the mirror. There was no version of myself in that reflection that made sense anymore. That night, a storm rolled in. I woke up to the sound of rain hammering the windows, wind dragging against the siding. A flash of light. Then thunder. The clock on my nightstand blinked 2:13 a.m. I got up, pulled on a sweatshirt, and wandered downstairs. I found him standing on the back porch, barefoot, his arms crossed tightly. Rain pooled around his ankles. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. I didn't answer. Just stepped out beside him. The cold was instant, biting, and sharp. But I didn't go back in. He started talking. Not about us. About his father. About how lonely it had felt growing up in a house full of noise but no real connection. About how he used to pretend he was invisible just to avoid conflict. About how sometimes, being invisible felt safer than being noticed. I didn't say anything. I just listened. Because it was the first time he'd really said anything that wasn't measured, wasn't filtered, wasn't cool or calculated. He wasn't trying to impress me. He was just tired. We stood there until the wind calmed, until the thunder rolled into the distance, until the rain was nothing more than a whisper on the gutters. We went back inside separately. The next morning, my husband decided to make breakfast. A rare thing. He wanted to try a new pancake recipe he'd seen on YouTube. Something with ricotta and lemon zest. He whistled while he mixed batter. I sat at the island, hands clasped under the counter. He asked his nephew to help. "You're the expert now," he joked. The two of them stood side by side, flipping pancakes like nothing was wrong. I dropped a fork. The clatter felt like gunfire. "You okay?" my husband asked. "Fine," I said too quickly. We sat down to eat. The pancakes were perfect. Light, fluffy, golden. I couldn't taste a thing. After breakfast, my husband went upstairs to shower. I stayed in the kitchen, putting dishes away slowly, deliberately, stretching the moment. He leaned on the counter across from me. "Last night," he said. "You heard everything I said?" I did. "Good." And then he walked out. I stood there for several minutes, unsure what he meant, unsure what I was supposed to do with that information. That evening, just before dinner, he offered to run out and grab some extra napkins and sparkling water. Said we were out. My husband handed him a 20 and asked him to grab some extra paper towels too. He left. A few minutes later, I noticed his jacket hanging on the hook near the door. The one he never left without. I reached into the pocket, half instinct, half curiosity. There was a folded receipt inside. From a small coffee shop in town. 2 lattes. 2 pastries. A date that matched the day my husband returned from his trip. The exact day he'd seen the Ring notification. I heard footsteps. My husband stepped into the kitchen, empty glass in hand. I held the receipt in my palm like it burned. He looked at it. Looked at me. And without saying a word, he walked over, took the receipt, folded it, and slid it into the trash. He smiled. "Movie night again," he said. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't considered before. He already knew everything. And he was choosing silence. The snow started early that morning. Wet and heavy, clinging to everything it touched. The power flickered once before going out completely. I stood at the window, watching the neighborhood go still, the kind of quiet that only happens when everything shuts off at once. No hum of the fridge. No distant lawnmower. No traffic from the highway. He walked into the living room with a stack of blankets and a box of matches. "No heat," he said. "We'll need the fireplace." We spent the next hour gathering wood from the pile on the side of the house, drying it near the hearth, and lighting a fire that crackled a little too eagerly. The house felt different without sound. Even my husband's voice seemed softer when he spoke, as if the silence demanded something in return. By noon, the three of us were in the living room, wrapped in blankets, passing around mugs of cocoa. My husband suggested Monopoly. "Let's make it interesting," he said, handing out the tiny metal pieces. He chose the top hat. I ended up with the thimble. His nephew picked the car. We played for nearly 2 hours. My husband was obnoxiously competitive, narrating every purchase like it was a Fortune 500 acquisition. He joked when I landed on boardwalk, called it a metaphor for my spending habits. When I laughed, I could feel the weight of 2 sets of eyes on me. One amused. The other unreadable. At one point, the nephew leaned forward and said, "Does the marriage license include a no flirting clause, or is that just assumed?" The room fell quiet. My husband chuckled awkwardly. "Guess that depends who you're flirting with." He didn't answer. By late afternoon, the storm had shifted to sleet. Everything outside was glazed in a thin sheet of ice. My husband had taken a call in his office, pacing and muttering about rescheduled meetings and backup generators. I grabbed my coat and slipped out, needing air, even if it was freezing. He found me 15 minutes later on the front porch, curled on the swing, scarf pulled to my ears. "I figured you'd try to disappear," he said. "I didn't." "You look like you want to." I didn't respond. He sat down beside me, careful not to let our bodies touch. The wood creaked beneath us. "I think about it a lot," he said after a moment. "What life would look like if we hadn't come here." "You mean, this house?" "This family." It wasn't a question. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. Later, we drove into town. The sleet had turned to mist, and the roads were slick. My husband had decided we needed fresh air and movement, so he suggested the bookstore. We hadn't been in months. It was nearly empty inside. Just a few couples browsing quietly and a cashier rearranging greeting cards. I wandered into the fiction aisle. He appeared minutes later, holding a book I hadn't seen in years. "You used to love this author," he said, placing the worn hardcover in my hands. "Said his stories made you feel understood." I took the book without a word. My husband called from across the store, distracted by a table full of journals. "Hey, come look at these." I walked over, the book still in my hand. We stood there for a few minutes, pretending to care about leather-bound covers and holiday discounts. Then he pointed to the parking lot. "Let's head home before the roads get worse." Back at the house, the fire had gone out. I offered to restart it while my husband went upstairs to shower. We were alone again. He stood near the unlit fireplace, holding the box of matches, not moving. "I keep thinking we're going to get caught," he said. "We already have." He nodded, slow and deliberate. "So what now?" I didn't answer. That night, while my husband slept, I walked down the hallway. I don't remember making the decision. My feet carried me there before my thoughts did. We spent night together. The next morning was colder. Brighter. Sunlight broke through the ice-covered trees, and the world looked silver and still. I woke up in my own bed, my husband already downstairs. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs. I pulled on a sweater and went down. He greeted me with a smile, held out a plate of toast like nothing had shifted. We sat at the kitchen table, pretending again. At one point, he asked about the weather. I told him the storm had passed. He nodded. Looks like things are clearing up. Then he asked his nephew to help him clean out the garage. Just for an hour, he said. We've been putting it off too long. They disappeared for most of the afternoon. I stayed inside, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning. Rearranging picture frames. Refolding towels. When they returned, both of them were flushed from the cold, laughing over something neither of them explained. It was the first time I'd seen them laugh together in days. That evening, we sat in the living room with the fire going again. My husband poured wine for the two of us. His nephew had excused himself, saying he needed to call a friend. I was halfway through my glass when I heard a familiar chime. My husband's phone lit up on the side table. He picked it up, squinted at the screen, and walked into the hallway. I stared at the fire. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then he returned, slid his phone into his pocket, and said, I printed something by accident earlier. It's in the office printer. He walked away. I followed. He was sitting at the desk, a single photo laid out in front of him. It was us. A candid. Taken from the back seat of the car on the way home from the craft fair. I remembered that moment. He had taken a selfie without thinking, capturing me in the background. I was looking at his nephew, smiling in a way I hadn't meant to. My husband tapped the edge of the photo. Nice timing, he said quietly. Right between stoplights. I didn't speak. He stood, handed me the picture, and walked out of the room. No yelling. No confrontation. Just a door left open behind him. The photo stayed in my coat pocket the rest of the night. I didn't look at it again. I didn't have to. That one image had burned itself into my memory with a clarity that felt colder than truth. I knew the exact moment it had been taken, the exact thought that had flickered through me when I looked at him that way. What I hadn't known was that it would be seen. The next morning, my husband acted as if none of it mattered. He was up early, making coffee, browsing his phone, humming something under his breath. The photo was gone from the office. Whether he burned it, shredded it, or folded it into some drawer I'd never see again, I didn't know. But he had made a choice. Silence, again. We barely spoke through breakfast. He asked about weekend plans. I mentioned the grocery list. He nodded. We moved around each other like coworkers who had shared something awkward and agreed never to reference it again. And then he suggested something unexpected. We haven't done a museum day in a while. Thought we could head into the city, maybe check out the portrait gallery. I didn't answer right away. He smiled. Come on, it'll be good to get out of the house. He didn't say it, but I could feel it, he was testing me. 2 hours later, the three of us were in the car. Traffic was light for a Saturday. The radio played quietly, classic jazz, the kind of station my husband turned to when he wanted things to feel curated. The Smithsonian Building came into view as we exited onto 7th. I watched as people in scarves and heavy coats gathered in front of the glass doors, their breaths visible in the chill. Inside, the museum was warm, filled with quiet footsteps and the occasional cough echoing off high ceilings. We split up quickly, unspoken. My husband veered toward a new exhibit on American presidents, and I walked toward the quiet wings at the back, where portraits of unnamed women lined the walls. I paused in front of one. A woman in a dark green dress, sitting beside a window, hands folded. Her gaze was distant, not bored, not sad, just far away. I studied her for a long time, until I heard him come up behind me. I like this one, he said. I don't know why, I replied. Because she looks like she's halfway between staying and leaving. I turned to him, but he was already walking away. We wandered separately after that. The air in the gallery felt heavier than it should have. The walls were too close, the lights too warm. Everything had meaning now, even the way we avoided each other's gaze. After an hour, we regrouped at the entrance. My husband clapped his hands together like we'd just finished a family outing worth remembering. Let's grab a late lunch, he said. There's that French place near DuPont I've been wanting to try. We ended up in a corner booth with soft music and too many mirrors. The menus were printed on thick parchment, and the waitress had an accent my husband tried to mirror when he ordered. I barely ate. He told stories, mostly from college, and somehow made them all about loyalty. His nephew sat quietly. He barely touched his food either. The drive back was silent. When we got home, the house felt too clean, too still. My husband retreated upstairs to change, and I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the half-used bottle of wine on the counter. I didn't pour a glass. I just stared. Then he said it. He knows. I turned. He was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You saw the photo, I said. He nodded. He hasn't said a word, but he knows. What are we supposed to do? He didn't answer. That night, there was no fire. No games. No movie. We all drifted into separate corners of the house. I heard footsteps upstairs, then the sound of the shower. A door closing. Silence again. Sometime after midnight, I walked into the hallway and found his door cracked open. A sliver of light. I didn't go in. I returned to my room and sat in the chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the street. The snow was nearly gone now. What remained had turned to slush, gray and tired. The next morning came with strange energy. My husband was already dressed. Not work clothes, not casual either. Something in between. He poured coffee, handed me a mug, and told me we had dinner plans. A family barbecue. His sister's house. I blinked. Today? Yeah. Figured it's been a while. It felt too sudden. Too forced. But he was already texting someone. Smiling. The drive there was quiet. He played the radio louder than usual. We pulled into a suburban street with identical houses, trimmed lawns, inflatable decorations still sagging from Thanksgiving. His sister greeted us on the porch, overexcited, arms flailing, face glowing. She hugged me like nothing had changed, like she couldn't feel the tension stretched between us like wire. The backyard was full. Folding chairs, paper plates, music too loud from a small Bluetooth speaker. Cousins I barely recognized. Laughter that felt like static in my ears. He stayed close to the grill. I watched his nephew drift toward the far corner of the yard, under the shade of a tree. He didn't come near me. He didn't even look my way. Half an hour passed before I made my way toward him. Slowly. Careful not to attract attention. We stood together, facing away from the crowd. I can't keep doing this, he said, voice low. I know. I don't know what this is anymore. I stayed quiet. This isn't right. It never was. He turned then, looked at me with something heavy in his eyes. I have to leave. He didn't mean the barbecue. By the time we got home, it was dark. He packed his bag in silence. I stood in the hallway, watching the zip slide shut. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't hug me. He just walked down the stairs and out the door, leaving it open behind him. My husband stood in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. He didn't ask where he went. Didn't comment. Just handed me a spoon and said, "Taste this." Too much salt? I shook my head. Later that night, after everything had gone still again, I stepped outside to get the mail. The cold bit through my sweater. The sky was clear for once. Inside the mailbox was a small envelope. No name. Just tucked in, as if left by someone who didn't want to be seen. I opened it slowly. Inside was a paper napkin. From that same cafe downtown. Written in ink, just one word. Mistake? I stood at the kitchen sink with the envelope in one hand, the napkin in the other. The word on it, small, slanted, written in the kind of pen you find near register counters, kept vibrating in my chest like a stubborn echo. Mistake? I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at it. Eventually, I folded it twice, tucked it into the back of a cookbook I hadn't opened in years, and washed my hands as if the paper had left something on me. The house felt hollow the next day. There was no music, no chatter, no background of two men moving through the same space with completely different rhythms. Just me. And him. But not him anymore, he had left. Now it was only my husband. And yet, he was acting like nothing had changed. He suggested pancakes again, offered to drive me to the store, made small comments about weekend weather and leftover chile. He even complimented my sweater like he used to, before any of this began. It was worse than silence. We both knew what was underneath everything. But he kept layering normalcy on top of it like fresh snow hiding frozen ground. It made every word heavier. After lunch, I went for a walk alone. The sidewalks were still damp from melted ice. Mailboxes stood crooked, and garbage bins leaned against one another like tired neighbors. I passed by the park near the elementary school, the one we hadn't visited in years. A mother was helping her daughter off the swing, both of them bundled in oversized coats. It felt like a postcard from a life I'd forgotten how to live. When I returned, the living room was empty. A mug sat on the coffee table, still warm. My husband's jacket was gone from the hook. I found him in the garage, organizing boxes. The same boxes we'd left untouched since the day we moved in. He looked up. Thought I'd clean this out finally. I didn't say anything. He held up a box labeled holiday lights and smiled faintly. You always hated how tangled these get. I nodded. By evening, the house was spotless. Rooms looked untouched, like we were staging it for a sale. He made soup of tomato bisque, the one he said reminded him of his grandmother, and we sat across from each other at the dining table, spoons scraping quietly. I think I'll go visit my sister this weekend, he said. Okay. She wants help organizing the attic. Something about old yearbooks and broken fans. I nodded again. That was how we communicated now, through the shape of each other's silence. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. A note sat on the kitchen counter, back by Sunday evening. Text me if you need anything. He hadn't signed it. For the first time in weeks, the house belonged only to me. Not to a secret. Not to a decision. Not to anyone else's version of who I was supposed to be. I spent the first hour walking from room to room, touching furniture, wiping clean countertops that didn't need it. I opened the windows, let the cold air sting my skin. By midday, I drove to the church on the edge of town. I didn't believe in much anymore, but the stained glass had always quieted something in me. It was empty inside. I sat near the back, in the second-to-last pew, watching the colored light dance across the polished wood. A woman sat 3 rows ahead. I hadn't noticed her until she turned slightly. Her coat was navy, her hands clasped tight in her lap. She didn't look back at me. But after a moment, she spoke without facing me. You look like you're hiding something. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stared ahead, toward the altar, toward the place people went when they wanted to be forgiven for things they hadn't admitted yet. When I finally left, the wind had picked up again. Branches scratched the sides of buildings. The town felt deserted. I drove back through the old neighborhood on the north side, the one where my husband and I had our first apartment. I hadn't been there in years. Most of the buildings were repainted. Some looked like they belonged to another state entirely. A for rent sign hung in front of the building where we used to live. A single lamp was on in the top floor window. That had been our bedroom. I used to watch the streetlights blink through the blinds and wonder what our life would look like 5, 10 years down the line. I hadn't imagined this. By the time I got home, the sun was already setting. The house was still empty. The air inside was warmer than I remembered. I stood in the foyer for a moment before heading upstairs. I passed by the guest room, the one where he had slept. I hadn't opened that door since he left. I didn't plan to. But something made me pause. The doorknob turned easily. The room was clean. Too clean. The bed was made, the closet empty. But on the dresser there was a book. The same book he had handed me at the bookstore. The one I never finished. I picked it up and found a folded sheet of paper inside. Not a note. Not a confession. Just a page ripped from a magazine, tucked between 2 chapters. On it was a quote, highlighted in yellow. Sometimes the right thing and the hardest thing are the same. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I put the book down, went into my room, and sat at my desk. I opened my laptop, checked emails I hadn't opened in weeks, ignored messages from the book club and the neighborhood committee. I found an old application I had started a year ago, volunteer work at the library downtown. I filled it out. Submitted. Then I opened the drawer where I'd hidden the napkin. It wasn't there. I tore through the cookbook. Page by page. Nothing. I checked the trash. The desk. The counter. Nothing. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, breathing fast, hands trembling without knowing why. The front doorbell rang. I turned too fast, nearly knocking over a chair. At the door, I paused. Through the frosted glass, I could see a figure. Blurred. Still. I opened it slowly. He was standing there. Not with a bag. Not with an apology. Not even with a word. Just standing. Our eyes met. And then he opened his mouth to speak. But didn't. We stared at each other. And then it cut to silence. The wind outside was sharp, but neither of us moved. He stood on the doorstep like he'd been frozen there, as if knocking had already been too much. His eyes searched mine for something he hadn't rehearsed, something he probably didn't even name. I opened the door wider without a word. He stepped in. The air between us was different now. Thinner. More fragile. The silence wasn't the same silence that had defined those weeks before, it was layered now with endings and consequences. I walked past him toward the kitchen, hands steady though my heart wasn't. He followed, slower than usual. There was a weight to his steps. The kind you carry when you've come back for something that no longer belongs to you. I shouldn't have come, he said. I didn't answer. He leaned against the counter, avoiding my eyes. I just needed to know if it felt like a mistake to you too. I looked out the window. The trees were still bare. Nothing was blooming yet, but spring was close. I don't know what it feels like anymore, I said. Neither of us sat. We stayed on opposite sides of the kitchen like strangers trying to find common ground in a house filled with shared ghosts. He stayed for 10 minutes. Maybe 15. He didn't ask for coffee. Didn't sit down. Didn't touch anything. When he finally turned toward the door, I thought that was it. The last page. But as his hand reached for the knob, my husband stepped into the hallway. No sound. Just presence. He froze mid-step. Their eyes met. Not long, but long enough for everything unspoken to pass between them. Then my husband did something unexpected. He walked past both of us, opened the pantry door, pulled out a can of soup, and said over his shoulder, "If either of you is staying, dinner's at 7. If not, please lock the door behind you." He walked upstairs without waiting for a response. The silence left in his wake was heavier than anything I'd felt between us. The door remained open. He looked at me again. "This isn't real anymore," he said. "It was never meant to be." He stepped outside. I closed the door behind him. The next morning, my husband was gone again. No note this time. Just his car missing from the driveway and his side of the bed made perfectly, without creases. The house was silent again. But it was a different silence now. Final. Settled. Like dust after a storm. I busied myself with everything. Washed towels that were already clean. Sorted spices alphabetically. Moved furniture by inches just to prove something had shifted. I opened closets and repacked linens I hadn't touched since we moved in. By noon, I left the house. I drove through town aimlessly. Past the post office, the dry cleaner, the hardware store where we used to argue about paint colors. I didn't stop anywhere. I ended up at the park near the lake, the one we always said we'd picnic at but never did. I sat on the bench overlooking the water, watching wind cut across the surface in long silver lines. A family was nearby. 2 kids throwing breadcrumbs to ducks, squealing with laughter as they chased after one another. Their mother watched from a distance, sipping from a coffee cup and smiling absently, as if the sound no longer startled her. It was strange, sitting there alone, watching someone else's life unfold with such simplicity. I stayed until my fingers went numb. Back home, the house was still empty. I didn't expect to see him again. Not that day. Not ever. But he came back. Not to the house. To the bookstore. I saw him through the glass as I crossed the street. He was standing in the corner, flipping through a paperback with half a cover missing. I froze. He hadn't seen me yet. I stepped inside, heart quiet but tense. He looked up. We didn't speak. He placed the book back on the shelf, nodded once in my direction, and walked past me toward the exit. That could have been it. Should have been it. But then he stopped at the door. Turned. I was going to tell him, he said. That last night. I know. I still might. I didn't answer. He left without another word. I stood in the aisle between rows of hard covers and didn't move for a long time. When I got home, my husband's car was back in the driveway. Inside, the kitchen smelled like onions and thyme. Something simmering on the stove. He was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, acting as if nothing had happened. I ran into your nephew, I said, setting my keys on the counter. He looked up, expression neutral. Where? The bookstore. He nodded. Did he say anything worth remembering? He said he might tell you everything. He didn't respond. Just stood up, walked past me, grabbed a wine glass from the cabinet, poured half a glass of something red, and said, then let him. The next day, he was gone again. No message. No phone call. No trail. I waited for something. A sign. A break. A collapse. But it didn't come. Until the envelope. A week later. No return address. Inside was a copy of our marriage license. And a second sheet of paper. A single typed sentence. You're free now. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter like it had always belonged there. Plain, unmarked, weightless in my hand until I opened it. I unfolded the paper slowly, the edges slightly curled, like it had been handled more than once before being sealed. I stared at the 2 lines for a long time. Marriage certificate, copy enclosed. You're free now. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. There was no explanation. No closure. No anger. Just an administrative act with an emotional explosion hidden underneath its simplicity. No signature. Just silence. I placed the papers on the table and sat down in the nearest chair. My hands were flat against the wood, my breath shallow. The refrigerator hummed in the background. A neighbor's car door slammed shut outside. Life, apparently, continued. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text. I didn't cry. I just sat there, letting the gravity of that sentence settle in my spine like cold water. By mid-afternoon, I got dressed. Not because I had somewhere to be, just because I needed to prove to myself that I still moved. That I still made choices. I grabbed my coat, my bag, my keys. I didn't look back at the envelope. I drove aimlessly. Ended up near the library where I'd submitted that volunteer application. I parked but didn't go in. I watched through the large glass windows as people moved inside, checking books, flipping pages, whispering to children. All of them unaware of how fragile their own lives might be. How one envelope could reset everything. Then I drove to the grocery store. The parking lot was half full. I didn't need anything, but I walked inside anyway, wandered the aisles like someone retracing old habits. In the tea section, I saw the same peppermint green tin he once pulled from our pantry. The one from the first day. I stared at it, considered putting it in my basket, then left it where it was. I moved through the frozen foods. Past the bakery. The wine aisle. Toward the back, near the refrigerators, I paused. And there he was. Standing by the self-serve soup counter. Alone. Wearing a gray sweatshirt, headphones slung around his neck, eyes scanning the options like he hadn't just torn apart a life. He hadn't seen me yet. I almost turned. Almost walked away. Almost made it clean. But I didn't. He looked up. We locked eyes. Neither of us moved. I walked toward him slowly. He didn't step back. I wasn't expecting to see you here, he said. I didn't expect to come here, I answered. He gestured to the row of ladles and containers. I was just hungry. You always are. A small smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, but it didn't last. He looked older somehow. Less certain. Less sure of the charm he once used like a shield. I stepped beside him, picked up a lidless container, stared into the butternut squash soup like it might offer answers. Then I said it. He sent me the divorce. His expression changed. But not in the way I thought it would. There was no shock. No panic. No joy. Only a quiet resignation. I figured he would. You knew? He nodded. I put the container down. Why are you here? I asked. He took a long breath. I came back for work. A meeting. It was supposed to be a quick trip. Was? I extended it. I nodded, lips pressed together, trying to hold down something sharp rising in my chest. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in weeks. "I didn't expect to see you," he said again. "But maybe I hoped I would." We stood in silence, surrounded by the buzz of fluorescent lights and the soft hum of background music. Someone's child cried near the checkout. An employee called for assistance on aisle 3. It was all so mundane. And yet, nothing about it felt ordinary. Then he asked the question I didn't expect. "Would you ever consider starting over?" I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I didn't trust it yet. We stood there another moment longer. He didn't push. He just nodded slightly, like he understood that timing could undo even the most honest questions. And then I left. I walked out of the store, keys tight in my hand, coat unzipped, air colder than I remembered. I sat in my car with the door closed and the engine off, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Was I free now? Or just floating? That night, I didn't cook dinner. I didn't wash the mugs in the sink or fold the laundry still sitting in the dryer. I lit a candle in the living room and sat in silence with my legs tucked underneath me, the house dim and still. I didn't hear his car. I didn't see the headlights. But when I opened the door, he was there. This time, he didn't hesitate. No suitcase. No questions. Just him. We stared at each other. He opened his mouth to say something. And then, it all went silent.